distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Now, don't worry that if you think I might have a Clint Eastwood complex. In fact, I have a Harrison Ford complex, as in Harrison Ford in Indiana Jones, searching for things that other people believe don't exist. I've been searching for something that no one believed existed, and I have found it in abundance across the developing world, starting for me in the back streets of Hyderabad in south-central India, where I was doing consultancy work for the International Finance Corporation, the private arm of the World Bank. And I had a hunch that actually there was something more exciting than the high-end private schools, the elite private schools I was raising funds for. And I went searching in the slums of the back streets of Hyderabad and found what I thought I would find, a school in a small home, but a school not funded by the public, but funded purely by parents, the fees charged to parents. And I went looking again and found another and another, and soon I was in contact with a federation of 500 of these low-cost private schools. And I asked parents, typically Muslim mothers in the old city of Hyderabad, why are they sending their children to private schools when the public schools are free? They get free books, free lunch at lunchtime. And time again, it was said to me, because in the government schools, our children are abandoned. I had that same word, but or synonyms of that word. Our children are abandoned. So I went looking in one of the public schools nearby. It was in a very nice building compared to the rather ramshackle buildings of the low-cost private schools. I went with the deputy education officer. They knew we were coming, and we walked into the very first classroom. There were 130 children crowded into this space with mosquitoes everywhere, these bright-eyed, bushy-tailed children wanting to meet their visitor, wanting to learn, and yet abandoned. There was only one teacher in that school, and there should have been 7 or 8. The children were abandoned, and it broke my heart to see this. And I went back to Washington, D.C., to the International Finance Corporation, and I said, do you not realize what's happening in the slums of, well, at least Hyderabad? There are these low-cost private schools, and the children are abandoned in the public school, the government schools, and so on and so on. And they said, Tooley, calm down, Tooley. Calm down. You found a few businessmen exploiting the poor, nothing much to see there. And I thought, this is not right. I've seen something more impressive than this. So I managed to get funding from the John Templeton Foundation to go and investigate more fully, and went to places like Makoko. Anyone been to Lagos in Nigeria? Excellent. So you will have flown into Murtala Mohammed International Airport, and then if you're like any typical expat coming in from outside, you will have driven along Third Mainland Bridge on your way into VI, Victoria Island, the posh part of the city, and you will have looked down and you would have seen Makoko, the shanty town built on stilts into the dark waters of the Lagos Lagoon. So I looked down as I traveled in with my hosts, and I said, that's where I want to go. That's where I'm going to find the low-cost private schools. And my hosts, Nigerians hosts, said, it's too dangerous. You can't go there. So the next day I went on my own and took a taxi there to the edge of the slum, and the taxi driver said, can't go any further. It's too dangerous. So I took a canoe, and there, on the edge of the lagoon there, Ken AD Private School, not Kennedy Private School, Ken AD Private School, one of 32 private schools we found in that small area. Or again, if you go to Kenya, Nairobi, you look down into Kibera, and you think, where does George go to school? Before we started this work, people assumed he was out of school or he was in a government school. But go down into the slum with him, and you'll find over 100 low-cost private schools there in that slum alone. And even in rural China, where I went with a PhD student from Newcastle University, we asked of peasant farmers still doing the same work they'd done for hundreds of years about private schools in the mountains. We abandoned a car, went on a 3-wheeler, and then at the end of a 2-day journey, we found People's Hearts, Mingjing Private School, where the children sang to not abandon the idea of what we were doing. And this is one of 586 low-cost private schools in the mountains of Gansu province. So I wrote a book, The Beautiful Tree, as Peter kindly said, and that book has set the case. But I was criticized on many levels. I was a bit of a pariah in education departments and universities, as you can probably imagine, talking about the role that the private sector has in developing education for the poorest members of society, and I was picked up on that. Poorest members of society, you've looked at Nigeria, Kenya, India, Ghana, they're not really the poorest places, are they? And there was something in this, so I decided to do the same work in some of the most difficult places on this planet, and that is war-torn countries in Africa. So I went to South Sudan. This is Gudeli, just outside the capital, Juba, where, you've guessed it, we found low-cost private schools serving the poorest members on this planet, really. I went to Somalia, and Somaliland, just again in the middle of its civil war, and again found this is a functioning school in Hargeisa. Again, finding lots of low-cost private schools. Sierra Leone, these are the children of the stonebreakers just outside Freetown. Again, they're in low-cost private schools, and as war ends, the private schools mushroom. They are the payoff for the ending of war. And I went to Liberia, where we did the study in 5 of the slums of Monrovia, the capital. This is West Point. We also did the study in Chicken Soup Factory, and you can probably guess why the slum was called Chicken Soup Factory. We also did the work in a slum called Red Light, and you'd be wrong if you tried to guess why it was called Red Light. It was named after the functioning traffic light in Monrovia, and we found many schools like this, and particularly this one here, and I just wonder nowadays if you go into the slums of Liberia, whether you're going to find a Donald Trump Institute daycare in elementary school. Who knows? So look, this was huge reason to celebrate, huge reason to get very excited about this sector. This really genuinely is a private sector grassroots initiative which is catering to the poorest in society and transforming their lives. And you have a paper here which is more academic than this presentation, of course, but those are 5 of the features of low-cost private schools that I emphasize in the paper. This is not some small-scale phenomenon. The ubiquity is there. We've estimated 450,000 low-cost private schools in India alone, 12,000 low-cost private schools in Lagos State, Nigeria. And typically in the slums of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, you get 70 to 80% of poor children in these low-cost private schools. So it's a massive phenomenon. They're higher quality. We've done a lot of standardized testing in schools. Other people, including Kartik Muralidharan, you mentioned just now, the Indian professor. Lots of work has been done, and typically, not surprisingly, children in the low-cost private schools outperform those in the government schools. A lot of the critics of these schools in the beginning said, well, they can't be that good. They're probably biased against girls. Girls are the worst affected in the poor areas. And in fact, the opposite is true. There's typically more girls than boys in these low-cost private schools, except in some really, what you might call, what would you say, areas of the world like rural Pakistan, Afghanistan, where there is discrimination against girls, and so there are fewer girls in the private schools, but the presence of private schools, low-cost private schools, enhances the girls' ability to go to school, not distracts it. They're affordable. We've done a lot of work on the affordability for families on the poverty line. How much can they afford? And we find there's typically, price matters, and there are schools at a price point that suits most parents in the slums. And then perhaps most remarkably, when I first went to these schools in the slums of Hyderabad, I and they were run by Muslims. I assumed, well, they must be philanthropic. There are mosques and so on supporting them. But then when you see 500 of these schools, you think, well, it's unlikely that there's so much philanthropy in this world. And you realize, actually, typically, these schools that I've described around the world in the beautiful tree and elsewhere, typically these schools are run as businesses, small businesses, and therefore, not only are they scalable, but they're sustainable. They're a scalable and sustainable solution to the problems of education. So they are, in fact, the Holy Grail. I mentioned Harrison Ford at the beginning. He's looking for the Holy Grail. I found the Holy Grail of education in the slums of the developing world. Great reason to celebrate. I've been celebrating ever since, creating some chains of low-cost private schools. This is Omega Schools in Ghana, and then associations, federations of low-cost private schools. This is the wonderful Nigerian name AFED, the Association of Formidable Education Development, and I'm the one in the middle, in case you can't spot me. I'm not sure if that joke carried in the translation. But anyway, great achievement. 5,000 low-cost private schools as members, nearly 1 million children in those schools. And this is in the slums across Nigeria, including in the north, in the dangerous northern parts. So great reason to celebrate. But that was the first part of my talk. But then the second, and that was not necessarily new material, but when I would give talks like this, particularly in America, but also in England, also in Europe, people would say, why doesn't this happen in America? Why doesn't this happen in England? Why there's this great grassroots, spontaneous order, to use the Hayekian phrase, of education going on elsewhere? Have we solved the problem in here? And I think I put in the paper, some 6 reasons on page 3, why not in America. Perhaps public schools are not as bad as they are in the developing world. Public education alternatives crowd out low-cost private schools, perhaps. The regulations in the West are too onerous. Now, it's not to say the regulations aren't onerous in India or Nigeria, but the advantage you have in India or Nigeria is you can ignore the regulations. The inspector calls not expecting to tick off the regulations, but he expects to receive something under the table, and that's the end of the regulations. So regulations are too onerous or too firmly enforced. Maybe costs are just simply too high in the West, meaning that private education can never truly be affordable. Then there is the lure of welfarism, isn't there? That we are so used, as Peter, you said yesterday, we are so used to the state providing all sorts of goods for us, including education, that maybe it's just too hard to break through that. And building on that, number 6, maybe there are no educational entrepreneurs or investors who are interested in education in England, in America. So those are the sort of 6, there was a 7th, which is I've dropped, but those are 6 of the reasons why I thought, okay, you've got this phenomenon elsewhere, grassroots, spontaneous order, why not in America? There seem to be 6 good reasons in theory. But what about in practice? I had the theoretical support for why there aren't any low-cost private schools in America. But actually, had I actually looked, and of course, I had the same story about Nigeria and India and Ghana and the rest of Somalia. Everyone said, well, there are no low-cost private schools there, so one has to go looking, and one finds. And so I went looking in America. Are there sustainable, low-cost private schools in America? It's a qualitative approach, and I've had quite a fun journey over the last year or two. I've made 6 visits to America. I just flew in 2 days ago from Los Angeles, and I'm doing some work in California and Oregon on the West Coast. And the truth is, there are low-cost private schools in America. This one is this is called EPIC, EPIC School in Salis, in rural Mississippi. It felt rather like being in rural Nigeria. I was the only white man in the village. they were so excited to have a white man in the village, they sent the press photographer to capture the moment. And this is a low-cost private school set up by this husband and wife team here in 3 trailers and in a small field just outside the major cities. And, I guess some people's reaction here might be, well, schooling in a trailer, is that really what we are reduced to in rural Mississippi? Mississippi, incidentally, is the poorest state in America, typically. And Matt, you'll support me on this. It's the United Kingdom is as poor as Mississippi, so we are as poor as the poorest state in America. That's what socialism can do to you. That's what socialism can do. But anyway, this is a poor state, but is it really preferable? Well, then I spoke to the students. Why have they left the state schools, the government schools, the public schools as they call them? Why have they left them to come to this small school where the fees were $3,500 per year? $3,500 per year, so dirt cheap for America. And I spoke to many of the kids, well, all the kids there, and they said one used the word, we're refugees from the public schools, from the government schools. In the public schools, so the boys typically had stories of terrible bullying, horrible bullying, mostly involving the public toilets and just teachers who were incapable of doing anything about it, just incapable, indifferent perhaps, or just realized it was too much of a struggle to stop these boys being abused in the toilets. And the girls typically told me the story of, well, it's fine. Public school, the state school, the high school is fine, but it's like we call it public school daycare. We go in there, chat to our friends, and then we come out again. We don't do any work. And so these kids have each one has a very valid reason why they've left the state school, the government schools, and why they are coming to this school, their parents paying $3,500 per year, and why this school is growing and thriving, even if the buildings don't look as great as they could be. They certainly don't look as professional as the public high schools, the state high schools, although if you go and see the state high schools, what will really strike you, I think, is the presence of the armed police officers outside and the way the state schools look rather more like prisons than schools, and you don't know whether the police are there to stop people going in or to stop people coming out. So this one is epic in Salis, rural Mississippi. Talking about refugees, this is now genuine refugees. This is a private school in a mosque in Clarkston, Atlanta, Georgia. Clarkston is the area of Atlanta, Georgia, and one of the areas where there are most languages spoken, where there are most refugees from around the world. And Guhad is a Somali refugee, and his school caters mainly for Somalis, Iraqis, Syrians, a couple of other nationalities, and Black Americans. And he is running this school for, again, that magic figure, $3,500 a year. It's a mixed type of school where they use some technology from some of their lessons, and as you can see in the second photo, but they also have face-to-face teaching. And I was particularly interested in, when I was visiting all these schools, to get their business models. Because it's always surprising to see something like this and think, is this sustainable on that small amount of money? And I've got, I can share these with you, and I don't think they are in the paper, I think I took them out, but I can share these models there and show how, with the data given to me by the proprietors, these schools are sustainable. They can run at a small surplus or break even for those very low costs. Or how about, that's Mount Rushmore behind me. I was convinced, that I wanted to look in what I was told were the most deprived areas of America, which are, can anyone guess? I mean, well, there are several types, but the the reservations for Native Americans were, I was told, the poorest areas, the most deprived. I was very exercised what to call the people here, Native Americans, indigenous, First Peoples, whatever. They told me, call us Indians. So this is the Indian reservation in South Dakota, in Pine Ridge, just near Mount Rushmore. And this is Mary Jo Fairhead, who is a proprietor of a low-cost private school. In this case, charging $5,500, something like that, US dollars a year. 32 kids. And again, story after story after story from the children and their parents and their grandparents often, because often the children are in prison. The grandparents are looking after these kids. And they're saying in the public school, in the state schools, children are abandoned. The same word that I first heard in the slums of Hyderabad, the same word is coming out again in the low-cost private schools that are just emerging in America. And finally, this was one I saw last week up in Oregon. This is Gracious Me Academy, and serves a rural community called Grants Pass, just off the road, on the Rogue River. And these two are first-generation Americans from Mexico. And they've created this beautiful, beautiful school in the forest. They live in one of the buildings. They have 2 buildings for schools. Small number of kids, 50 kids, charging $355 US dollars per month, so times by 10, about 3,500 per year. And again, really benefiting from the children benefiting from the close attention there to detail. So look, that's the sort of, those are the sort of qualitative findings that I've been exploring schools on the ground and getting a sense of the excitement that I feel that excitement there. But we did some quantitative research as well, and we used one of the national agencies, Morning Consult. We did a nationally representative survey. We oversampled for parents in low-income households with children in private schools, and then we corrected, obviously, for that bias. And we were very careful with our definitions, because the problem now with all data in America, and I was going to say the same about the OECD data and whatever, no one has got a way of counting these sort of unregistered schools. I'll just tell you a little bit about the regulations for a second. So I was in California and Oregon this week. Those are the most, in American terms, liberal, left-wing states in America. And so you don't get any opportunities for vouchers or educational savings accounts or so on that are in, I think, 10 or 11 states in America now experimenting and trying these ways of providing funding for the poorest families. So California and Oregon will never see those. The Californian Teaching Union is far too strong. It will always cancel any attempt to bring in vouchers or the like. But they do allow charter schools, a limited number of charter schools in California. And the limited number of charter schools includes a very, very, very small number of charter schools that cater for homeschooling families. And it turns out there's no regulation which stops homeschooling families from going to school, a private school. So in each of those examples I've given you, most of the children in the schools are actually formally classified as homeschooled, because the regulations somehow can allow that loophole. And so you've got to be very careful counting, and no one else has really counted before, but this is what we found. And the number, in a sense, when you first hear the number, you think it's a bit disappointing. We found 4% of children were in low-cost private schools that's charging up to $5,000 US per year. 10% in other private schools, 5% homeschooled. So the vast majority, 81%, were in public schools. But that's a bit disappointing compared to those 70, 80% of children I mentioned in the other studies in Africa and so on. But as a percentage, it's low, but as an absolute number, it's not bad. You know, there are probably 2 million children in these low-cost private schools in America, 2 million, and there could well be 100, 125,000 of these schools. So there is something interesting going on, particularly then when you look at the demographics served by these low-cost private schools, and we find their ethnicity. Blacks are in a majority. The plurality. They're the highest. They're highest in these low-cost private schools than they are in any other school type. 36% in those schools. Interestingly enough, these are American titles, liberal meaning left. The population of these schools is more like, the parents are more likely to be left-leaning than they are conservative or moderate. And there are other indicators there. But predominantly the parents using these low-cost private schools, not surprisingly, are from low-income families themselves. 70% of the annual household income is less than $50,000 per year. So we've done a lot of work there. We've looked at satisfaction. That's just the full table just to show you we've been busy, not to look at in any detail now, but we've been very busy looking at all these things and coming to terms with this new phenomenon, because no one has heard of low-cost private schools in America before this work started, just as no one had heard of them in Africa or South Asia before. And one of the interesting things is that the percentage of children in the public schools, the state schools, that is declining year on year. And where are these children going? They're going to that range of options. But this sector of low-cost private schools is growing. So I'd like to conclude in my final 3 minutes with just linking with Peter's points last night, which talked about the Austrian schools, the Austrian economics view of the world. And you gave 7 very interesting headings yesterday. And it really is the case that the phenomenon of low-cost private schools, whether it's in Africa or South Asia or now in America, fits in so neatly with those 7 areas. Your first one was, without individual freedom, everything is nothing. I think that's the case here. But there is a danger. You carry on and say, freedom requires a certain degree of equality of opportunity. And I do fear that that is a statist, or it could fall foul to statist creep and start saying we need that equality of opportunity, so therefore we need the state to get involved in these type of schools. I believe that would be very dangerous. The second one was the price formed through free competition is the best aggregator of decentralized knowledge. Absolutely the case. And the really interesting thing about this market that I've been describing around the world is there's a whole range of fees that can be charged, and you can go there with your level of affordability in mind and choose the schools you want. So price is very much alive and dear in education, as it should be anywhere else. The third heading was the presumption of knowledge leads to dictatorship, and you mentioned that even the well-intentioned socialists, or this is Hayek's view, can lead directly to the rule of non-benevolent dictators, and you mentioned examples, Putin in Russia, the Revolutionary Guards in Iran. I think add to that list any member of a department for education in Britain, America, or other countries. They are actually non-benevolent dictators now. Fourth, you said the market is a dynamic process, and wonderful words. Prosperity arises from entrepreneurship and innovation that must not be hindered by the state. You're seeing that innovation and entrepreneurship emerging in these schools across the world, and it's great to see how they can innovate in the way that the public sector cannot innovate. There were a couple that weren't so relevant. And then finally, number 7, estatism is the problem. And you say the more the idea spreads that solution to all kinds of problems lies within the state, the harder it is for merit and personal responsibility to thrive. and the more clientelism grows. And that is exactly what I was saying was the reason I predicted why there wouldn't be low-cost private schools in America, because we are so used to statism. We are so used to the state serving up education that we find it hard to envisage the alternative. So I enjoyed your paper. It fitted everything together very neatly in terms of what I wanted to say. So I've given you my 3 parts. First of all, the background in Africa and Asia. Then there was the new forays into America. Thirdly, linking this to Austrian economics. And that's your 30 minutes. Thank you.